Hi, everyone, and welcome to the alarming world of deepfakes. I am Colin DeVries, president of the Deadline Club, the New York City chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. Check us out on deadlineclub.org and YouTube, and be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Some of the events to consider coming up are a journalism walking tour and happy hour at downtown Manhattan on Saturday, November 6th. And our annual holiday party, which is coming up on Wednesday, December 8th at the Salmagundi Club, which is the historic Fifth Avenue Arts Club that we call home in Greenwich Village here in Manhattan. You can learn all about this and more at deadlineclub.org, but please consider joining us to support journalists, a free press, and more thought-provoking panels like this one. Now, without further ado, let me introduce our host for the rest of the evening, Steve Dunlop, a Deadline Club past president who started his journalism career in the 70s as a radio reporter and editor. He later moved to television, where he reported and anchored for the 10 o'clock news on New York Channel 5, and later for Fox Television, NBC New York, Reuters, and CBS News. He's currently the president of Dunlop Media, a communications training and consulting firm, and a member of the Deadline Club Advisory Council. So Steve, take it away.
Thank you, Colin. Good evening, everyone. We have a lot to go through. I'm actually going to begin with a quick screen share, just so that we're all on the same page here. This is a lot about media, audio, video. So we are going to be doing a lot of screen sharing tonight. And throughout this important discussion, we'll be asking our own questions. We'll be on the lookout for yours. So if you have a question, don't hesitate to enter the chat. We'll actually also be checking the Q&A box for questions from the audience. We're going to be getting to those as we work our way through the next 90 minutes. I've got a quick disclaimer to share with you. Because we're going to be using a lot of third-party audio and video in this presentation from sources such as the BBC, NBC News, Reuters, Vice Media, YouTube, and Megaphone, which is a Russian mobile phone company. I just wanted to make clear that this is for educational purposes only. We respect all relevant copyrights, and we are going to assert that this is essentially falls under the US law known as the Fair Trade Doctrine under United States law. So before I introduce our panel, let me just begin with this picture. A little less than a year ago, this South Korean news anchor, Kim Joo-ha, was delivering what appeared to be an ordinary newscast filled with ordinary pictures. In fact, she was not actually on the screen, even though it appears she is. Kim Joo-ha had been replaced here with a deep fake version of herself, with identical appearance, gestures, facial expressions to the real article and vocal intonation down to the syllable. The Korean news network MBN said it would continue using deepfake anchors for some breaking news reports. So aside from the issue of how many journalists are going to be put out of jobs by this, I suppose a valid question would be, what are deepfakes? Another valid question, if you can deepfake a news anchor, can you deepfake anyone? How exactly are deepfakes made? How can you detect them? Does the technology come with promise alongside the peril? And what, if anything, can journalists do to stop their work from being manipulated? First, before we get into any of these questions, I'd like to introduce my co-moderator. And if you're having trouble seeing us, click the gallery view on your screen. That should be able to give you access to everyone's video. So first, my co-moderator, Robert Anthony. Robert is a Deadline Club past president as well, a veteran technology journalist and former senior writer at PC Magazine. He's written tech features for the New York Times, the New York Daily News, Time, Black Enterprise, and other publications, and has 1.1 million followers for his cool tech board on Pinterest. And now our panelists in alphabetical order. Henry Ajder. Henry is head of policy and partnerships at Metaphysic, a company developing artificial intelligence technologies for the responsible generation of hyper-real synthetic content. Henry is a leading expert on deepfakes and synthetic media, with his research and investigations mapping the evolving landscape over the last 3 years. He joins us tonight from the UK. Emma Cillikens. Emma, a member of the Deadline Club's Executive Council, an award-winning journalist and podcaster. She started out telling stories on stage and landed in journalism nearly 15 years ago now, working with the Wall Street Journal, ProPublica, Barron's, WNYC Radio here in New York, and other outlets. She is the co-creator of a podcast about artificial intelligence called In Machines We Trust, published in cooperation with the MIT Technology Review. Jareen Imam. Jareen is content creator for Amazon. Prior to her career in tech, she led a global team as the director of social news gathering at NBC News. She has worked in the media industry for more than a decade, specializing in social media, audience development, and verification of user-submitted content. And last but not least, Ashish Jaiman. Ashish is the product director for Microsoft's Bing multimedia team, focusing on tools and services for creators and the influencer community to engage users and drive growth through innovative storytelling. He's spoken extensively on deepfakes, and in an op-ed last fall for the Indian newspaper The Hindu, he warned of deepfakes' ability to, quote, inflict damage on individuals, institutions, businesses, and democracy. Although he also has some good things to say about deepfakes, so we'll be hearing from Ashish as well. So thank you all and welcome panelists. So just what are we dealing with? Let me get back to our screen share. I'd like to start with a brief history. In the case of deepfakes, it arguably goes back many centuries, for at least as long as forgeries of any kind have been around. But what might be considered modern deepfakes have been on the scene for much longer than we realize. Here's an 1865 engraving of President Abraham Lincoln by Thomas Hicks. Recently, well, not too recently, I believe the 1990s, historians discovered that the engraving is actually a copy of an 1852 engraving by A.H. Ritchie. The man on the right is John C. Calhoun, a former vice president who, ironically, as opposed to Lincoln, was a virulent racist and proponent of slavery. So why was this made? It turns out that after Lincoln's assassination, there was a shortage of quote unquote heroic poses of President Lincoln. So an early visual artist named Thomas Hicks simply took an engraving of Lincoln's head from the same Matthew Brady photo that was on the $5 bill in the US for decades, flipped it so that he's now looking left instead of right, and superimposed it on Calhoun's body. Hicks even went as far as to change the text on the papers of the desk on the right-hand side. In the A.H. Ritchie original, it said, and this is Calhoun speaking, strict constitution, free trade, and sovereignty of the states. When it came to the Lincoln version of this, Thomas Hicks changed those words to Constitution, Union, and Proclamation of Freedom. Apparently, it was almost a century before anyone noticed. This sort of thing was not uncommon in the decades after photography was invented. Fast forward to today. We are now decades into the digital age, and the ability to manipulate images, faces, and voices is becoming more widespread and more difficult to detect. A watershed moment came in 2018 when actor and filmmaker Jordan Peele produced a brief video featuring former President Barack Obama. Here's an excerpt.
We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time. You see, I would never say these things, at least not in a public address, but someone else would. Someone like Jordan Peele. This is a dangerous time. Moving forward, we need to be more vigilant with what we trust from the internet. It's a time when we need to rely on trusted news sources.
Okay, so I'm going to stop screen sharing just there right now, if we can. Okay. Bob Anthony, first question for you. I mean, this is an early deepfake. You can see that it's not quite up to what it's come to be today, but this had to be really scary when people first saw it and realized what technology was becoming capable of. You've covered this scene for a long time. What are your thoughts?
Well, if somebody was watching that on a small screen, like on their phone, on a low resolution TV, it looks so believable. I mean, even his Barack Obama's movements, his gestures are exactly what you would expect from him. So this video is it fools people so easily because it looks, because the facial expressions and the movement seem so real. Upon closer inspection, yeah, you can detect it, or I should say, we can detect it, us in the industry, but the average person might just go over his head. And that undermines us as journalists if people start believing basically what they say.
We have a lot more to touch on with this subject, but before we do, I'm going to start screen sharing again. We've got another clip to show you. The world really noticed the possibility of deepfakes just earlier this year when a video featuring a deepfake of the actor Tom Cruise surfaced. Here's that clip from March, which was featured on NBC's Today Show. Let's have a look.
The cruise ones from this week are being called some of the best and most unsettling examples of deepfakes yet.
I'm going to show you some magic. The real thing. I mean, it's all the real. Hey, listen up, sports and TikTok fans. If you like what you're seeing, just wait till what's coming next.
Scary. Not only was that an audio deepfake, a video deepfake, but obviously the audio was just incredibly down pat. Jareen Imam, part of your job as head of social news gathering at NBC was to screen user-submitted video for authenticity, I would imagine, as well as the content. What was your team's reaction when you first saw the Cruise piece?
So the team that I used to manage also not only reviewed user-generated content, but we also monitored for videos that were getting amplification and momentum. And this was a video that my former team and I discovered on TikTok as it was growing in engagement. And what was quite interesting was that at first there were a lot of comments on TikTok from users questioning whether this was really Tom Cruise, and because, like, you know, Gen Zers and those that are on TikTok were able to notice that this person seemed a lot younger than Tom Cruise in real life, but they still weren't able to decipher whether it was real or what degree of it was real or whether it was archival footage. What ended up happening is that my old team and I were actually able to track down the filmmaker who created this synthetic video, and he did it as an art project based in Europe. And basically, he said in the interview that we did an extensive report at NBC about it, where he used a combination of, he had an actor that he hired that had impersonated Tom Cruise as one of his acting jobs, and used a mass filtering tool as a way of doing basically a form of CGI. And it's very high-end synthetic video manipulation, and it was quite effective, so effective that after the interview with us, this video, which this account had only a couple thousand followers when we initially talked to him, but by the time we were finished with our interview, it grew to almost 1 million followers. He actually ended up deactivating the account and taking the videos down, and claiming that it was more to bring awareness. But this is a pretty good example of how deepfakes, like much of technology, is exponentially growing and getting better and better. However, some of the best deepfakes still currently are not 100% accessible to the general public. There are some rudimentary apps like Face Swap and even the filters on Snapchat, but this kind of manipulation is still used more so in the high-end filmmaking.
Well, you know, you brought up the creator of this particular deep fake, Jareen, and it segues perfectly into our next clip and guest. The creator is named Chris Ume. He went from, you said 2,000 followers to something in the millions. He also formed a company. It's an AI company called Metaphysic, and we're fortunate enough tonight to have Metaphysic's Director of Policy and Partnerships, Henry Ajder, joining the conversation from the UK. Henry, again, welcome. We're going to be hearing a Vice Media clip from Chris in just a minute, explaining how he built this. But before we do, and kind of piggybacking on the issues Jareen raised, I'd like to ask you, how did Chris decide on Tom Cruise for this experiment? I mean, he had the whole world to pick from. And did he seek Cruise's permission before producing it? Henry?
Sure, yeah. So the reason that Chris chose Tom for this example was that the actor he worked with, a guy called Miles Fisher, made a parody campaign of Tom Cruise running for president. And Miles, throughout his life, has been told he looks like Tom Cruise, and he's an actor, so he thought this would be a fun piece of work. Saw what deepfakes could do, or synthetic media could do, and asked Chris, who is one of the world's leading experts with this technology, to make this campaign come to life. That also went pretty viral. That got a lot of views. And afterwards, I think they realized that this kind of character of deep Tom Cruise was something that really resonated with people. And so Chris used his expertise in VFX, which he's developed over many years in combination with new open source tools, to develop the video series, which is still going today, with this character of Deep Tom Cruise, as Jareen said, intentionally made to look younger with the name Deep Tom Cruise, as a way to try and avoid that confusion. But as Janine said, it has caused quite a bit of confusion when taken out of context in particular. We didn't, or Chris did not seek Tom Cruise's consent before making this deepfake. Primarily because it's a work of parody and satire, in the same way that, you know, other satirists do not seek the consent of the people they're targeting, particularly when they are celebrities or people in positions of power. You know, it is not typically something which is done in your content, but it was something that he contacted Cruise's lawyers after he posted it, saying, you know, this is not something that we want cause offense, and if you want us to take it down, we can, and they never responded. So in this case, consent was not sought, given the context of it as a piece of satire or parody, with the kind of denoting factors around name and the aging. That was a decision that Chris took that thought was fair. Right. We're actually going to hear from Chris right now in this Vice Media clip, explaining how he built this. So let's switch back to our screen share, and let's advance this one slide. Here we go. You're going to hear Chris Ume explaining how he built this.
The first time I heard about deepfakes is the end of 2018. I was on a new channel where they were talking about people misusing the technology in pornographic videos. And that made me realize there were a lot of creative possibilities. A deepfake is a video where someone's face has been changed into another. So, for example, in the videos I make with Miles Fisher, you don't see Miles Fisher's face. No, you see Tom Cruise's face. I just overlaid it on top of Miles.
If you're helping 2020 together, we'll dominate the ballot box. This is no stunt.
The way I train a deepfake is where I tell a computer model to start training on thousands of images of a certain character. In my case, it's Tom Cruise. Thousands of images, all his expressions, all his angles. So in the end, I have like one big model, and it's like one big Tom Cruise model.
So we're going to stop the screen share right there. And let me ask the panel generally, if anyone has any thoughts on the possible misuse of this technology. We've obviously heard that Tom Cruise is not really objecting to this use, but we also have the possibility now of deepfaking just about anybody, as long as there's enough images of them out there on the internet for people to download and put into a computer program. I'll ask the question generally, but Henry, maybe you want to take a stab at this. Have we created a monster here?
Yeah, so prior to joining Metaphysic, I worked for the world's first deepfake detection company called Deeptrace. And during my time there, I conducted a lot of the kind of the first research of landscape mapping around malicious uses of the technology. When this first emerged in 2017, this was primarily being used to non-consensually swap women's faces into pornographic footage. But no one really wrote a report called The State of Deepfakes, which found that 96% of the deepfake videos online were this form of non-consensual image abuse, basically with all of them targeting women. Fast forward to 2021, the tools for creating this kind of malicious content have become increasingly accessible and gamified, and the models for creating them become increasingly efficient, requiring, for example, no on-device processing, highly kind of efficient data. So needing, for example, one image in certain cases, and realism has increased as well. Being used in fraudulent activity in the kind of cybercrime sphere. And although not direct uses, the very idea of deepfakes alone being used to kind of spark this sort of fear, what's called the lies dividend, that now that people understand that there are such things as deepfakes, it doesn't just make the fake things look real, but provides a way for real things to be dismissed as fake. And this is something I've worked with the human right in the world, where this concept has really caused chaos in critical context. So I don't think necessarily framing it as we've created a monster is necessarily the right way to put it. I think there are a lot of really exciting creative uses of the technology. You know, for example, we've seen how CGI in Hollywood is now actually the most popular use of detaining content. One of the most popular apps has generated over 3 billion videos now, to put it in context. Which needs to be
I'm gonna have to ask you to cut your answer short.
Seriously, and we are starting to see better action around that.
Yeah. Henry, we're having a little bit of connectivity difficulty with you.
Sure.
I don't
know
if you want to drop out and rejoin, but your audio is cutting in and out. Let me move on, because I want to continue exploring this issue by not just looking at the video that Chris Ume generated, but also the audio. The audio in that clip was just dead on Tom Cruise, but he never said those words. Emma Cillikens, Emma, we've seen all these deep fakes in the video space, but you work in audio. Do you see this synthetic media in audio too? And tell us what you've learned about it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We definitely see it in audio as well. But what is super interesting is when we have conversations like this, and when you hear about deep fakes in the public, so often the conversation is around videos because it's what people see, and they don't necessarily think about the audio side of things. And in a way, audio can be used in, I guess, if you want to be reductive, an evil or good way, right? So if we want to say in an evil way, even more so sometimes than video, because you can't actually see it. So you're only relying on one sense in that case. And we can get into that nuanced discussion in just a little bit. But yeah, basically I'm here tonight just to let you know it absolutely exists in just pure audio as well. It's not just video. So it could be as simple as someone calling you up that you think is someone you know, when in fact it's actually not. So that's happened in instances, and I'll get onto that in just a moment. But I think when I first kind of came across deepfakes was back in that 2018, 2019 period as well. I was working for the Wall Street Journal's audio team at the time, and the Wall Street Journal had a deepfakes task force where they actually trained some journalists to detect deep fakes. And at the time, I think it was around spring 2019, when the first really good example of audio deep fake kind of came out in the world. And you might recall it, you might have heard it in the past. It was Square AI's lab called DESA that created a synthetic version of podcaster Joe Rogan's voice. And you've got the clip there, Steve.
Friends.
Oops, sorry about that. Let's go back and hit it again. Here we go.
Friends, I've got something new to tell all of you. I've decided to sponsor a hockey team made up entirely of chimps. I'm tired of people telling me that chimps are not capable of kicking human ass in sports.
Should I put a language disclaimer on that?
Right.
Anyway, so the catch was
like
it wasn't actually his voice. It was trained via essentially an algorithm. And this type of technology that DESA came out with, they used text-to-speech deep learning system. They built it themselves. They called it Real Talk, and you can find kind of evidence of this on the interwebs. They announced it on a blog at the time, and this was just with text as an input to create that voice itself. And since that time, that was 2019, since that time, it's become a lot more sophisticated. You could probably hear, if you're a discerning listener, that voice wasn't quite right? It was okay, but there's little pauses, that maybe the intonation wasn't exactly how Joe Rogan would use his voice, but they've certainly become more convincing over time since that 2019 period. And you can even create your own deep fake version of your voice with software like Descript. And it's something that we've actually done ourselves in the podcast that I co-created called In Machines We Trust, which we produce with MIT Technology Review. And that is a podcast that's about the automation of everything. And we actually opened our very first season back in 2020. So that's last year, pandemic times, everything's kind of meshed into each other, with our host of our series, Jennifer Strong. Only the catch was, it wasn't just Jennifer.
If seeing is believing, how do we begin to navigate a world where we can't trust our eyes or ears? And so, you know, what you're listening to, it's not just me speaking. I had some help from an artificial version of my voice, filling in words here and there. Meet Synthetic Jennifer. Hi there, folks. I can even click to adjust my mood. Hi there. Yeah, let's not make it angry.
So that was our trailer to our very first season that came out last year. And since then, we've played around with synthetic voices, and we've brought back Synthetic Jennifer again, and we've retrained it. So essentially on this program called Descript, which people can get access to, you can create an artificial version of your voice using what they call overdub. And you train it by basically talking and recording your voice and reading a script of sorts. And their website says you can do it in about 10 minutes. We found that we had to do a lot more recordings to get a convincing version of a synthetic voice. But in terms of audio, this technology is out there, and regular folk can kind of use it, or a lot more, I guess, than experts. It's not as high level as CGI, and it's not as hard a barrier of entry when it comes to the audio space, which certainly I think is reason for some concern. But as with these type of conversations, people get concerned, alarmed very quickly. Oh my goodness, this is going to be used for bad. This is terrible. And don't get me wrong, it absolutely can be. And I'm going to have some examples of that in a moment. But it's not always the case. I think it's a very nuanced conversation around synthetic and artificial voices. It can kind of have a positive or negative influence. So for example, when we trained Synthetic Jennifer, this was put into our podcast to show that it's possible to do it, right? It's for educational purposes, it's for learning, even entertainment, if you're entertained by a podcast, right? So people could hear that it's possible. But that same program, Descript, also allows audio editors to train their hosts' voices. So say, for example, you're creating a podcast, right? And you go into a booth and you record your voice, and oh my goodness, you've got this amazing podcast, but you've missed like 5 words. If you train this artificial version of your voice, you can add the text in and add those 5 versions of the words that you missed. So it can save time for audio editors. But then the question around that is it actually ethical to be putting words into your host's mouth? And I think that's a conversation that the journalism industry is having right now. Maybe in entertainment that's ethical, maybe in journalism it's not, but I'll leave it up to you to decide as you're listening to this panel here today. And another place that this synthetic voice kind of pops up in a more kind of positive light, as opposed to that scary, alarming light, is that it's being used for things like artificial voices are being used for things like preserving oral histories, for example. So in an episode earlier this year that we did on the podcast, we found someone and interviewed them about the fact that they were having their parents record an oral history and essentially put it in kind of a voice assistant like technology. So when this person's parents eventually pass on, they can have a conversation with this AI, or maybe it's using artificial intelligence, maybe it's just recording about their parents' life. So, hey, mom, what happened when this happened in your life? And it will speak back at you that oral history. A little bit creepy, but is it dangerous? Who knows? What would those voices be used for? I think these are great conversations and questions to be asking as well. On the other side of things, I think audio deepfakes or synthetic voices can certainly be used for harm. And we've definitely seen a lot of those examples already in scams. So in the same podcast, In Machines We Trust, on this episode on AI and voice technologies, we found examples of scams where company employees are asked to transfer money from their CEO, but the only catch is it's not actually their CEO. And here, Pindrop Security CEO Vijay Balasubramaniam is speaking at a security conference about this particular thing going on.
But imagine if you, as a CFO or a chief controller, gets a phone call that comes from your CEO's phone number. It's completely spoofed. So it actually uses your address book and it shows up as your CEO's name. And then on the other end, you hear your CEO's voice with a tremendous amount of urgency. And we're starting to see crazy attacks like that. There was an example that a lot of press media covered, which is a $220,000 wire that happened because the CEO of a UK firm thought he was talking to his parent company, and he then, sent that money out. But we've seen as high as $17 million go out the door.
So $17 million is a lot of money being transferred on the basis of a fake voice. And as you heard earlier, that deepfake version of Jennifer's voice, my host, it's a little bit difficult to detect what's the real Jennifer and what's the fake Jennifer. And so as this technology improves over time, there's certainly a risk of more and more of these scams and not being able to necessarily trust your ears. So can you verify this information? Can you go straight to the source, send a text message, have a phone call with that person? Hey, I just want to double check. Was that you that actually authorized this thing? And federal prosecutors are certainly talking about this as well. At a Federal Trade Commission on voice cloning technology last year, they reported a huge uptick in this type of communication-focused crime. So it's happening, and that tracks as well. I've got one last example to present to you around a person that we interviewed who received what he thought was a call from his son from Mexico. And in this podcast, we refer to this person as Jim because he feared being identified and his family's safety.
I don't know if it was AI. I don't know if they had taken a recording of something he had done and were able to manipulate it. But I'm telling you, it was my son. And he is clearly agitated. This kid's a really chill guy. But when he does get upset, he has a number of vocal mannerisms. And this was like, oh my God, he's in trouble. And he basically told me, look, I'm in jail. I'm in Mexico. They took my phone. I only have 30 seconds. They said I was drinking, but I wasn't, and people are hurt. And look, I have to get off the phone, call this lawyer, and he gives me a phone number and has to hang up. It was him. It was his voice. It was everything, tone, the pauses, the gulping for air. It was everything that you could imagine.
So we don't actually have the sound of that son's voice, but this is the father recalling that story. And so to convince a father that his son is on the phone has got to be a fairly convincing deep fake. This was not his son on the phone. He managed to get onto his son and find out that it wasn't him. But this man actually, full disclosure, has a family member that works with MIT, so is totally aware of the technology space and these type of things that are happening, and still for a second was kind of like, hang on, fooled by this. And went to the primary source and confirmed that it wasn't his son. But the fact that you can hear that even the upticks and the concern and the upset in the voice was replicated means that perhaps there was a recording of his on the internet somewhere, maybe a YouTube video, maybe something else. Who knows where they got that voice from, but it was certainly used for harm. And in this case, the scammers did not get paid. However, it's something that is increasingly happening and something that journalists need to be aware of as they're reporting stories. But also just general public needs to be aware of, because that person on the other end of the phone may not necessarily be the person. So I think it's a nuanced conversation. It can be used on both sides when it comes to audio, but it's certainly something that can exist independent of video.
You know, Emma, I'm just reminded of that opening line of one of Charles Dickens' famous novels. It's the best of times and the worst of times. We've got such great promise for this technology, but such scary stuff that you've just outlined. You know, along the lines of the positive, it's worth noting that more and more examples of entertainment deepfakes are where the artists actually authorize the use of their likeness. And I'm just going to share the screen one more time and play this for you. This is actually a video where, just make sure we're playing here. There we go. It's silent because it's all in Russian. It's produced for Megaphone, the Russian mobile phone company. There's Bruce Willis, who licensed his likeness to Megaphone. And you can see that once again, they used an actor to kind of be the template for Bruce Willis's physical features. I'm going to ask Bob Anthony to jump in with some questions for all our panelists. But before I do that, I'd like to thank Ashish Jaiman from Microsoft for his patience. He's had to, I want to bring him in now. His job really has been to understand and decipher this technology at a granular level, not just because of his role with the Bing search engine, but also his prior role at Microsoft with the company as Director of Technology and Operations at the Customer Security and Trust Organization. Ashish, if you could just kind of take us under the hood of this technology. There's a term that's being used to describe it called GAN. Can you help us understand what this refers to and why we as journalists should be paying attention?
Well, thank you, Steve. So GANs, or GAN, is Generative Adversarial Network. And the idea there is, as you saw in the videos from Chris, as well as the Bruce Willis video, what you just saw, there are actors, but the model, the AI model, what we call, is trained on a number of images, right? As Chris described in his piece, that he would actually got the model trained on each and every expression of Tom Cruise by feeding a lot of images of Tom Cruise into an AI model, right? So that is how AI works, is like you give it a lot of data and it would try to correlate that data and give an output. What GAN is, you can think of the two AI networks, one which is creating. So think about what Chris's model was doing, was creating a fake or a deepfake of Tom Cruise. Then there is another network, which actually would then, you can think of as like rating this model to be true or false, right? So there is a creator and there is a discriminator. Creator creates a fake, discriminator would say, hey, this is not close enough, right? And what happens is, with this idea of this is not close enough, the creator goes back, the AI model goes back and then tweaks itself and again says, hey, is it good enough? And those two AI models actually compete against each other till the discriminator fails. What I mean by that is till the discriminator says, yes, this is good enough. And that's what generative adversarial networks are. They are two networks adversary to each other, fighting against each other. And in the end, the creator wins. What I mean by creator wins is that deepfake is real enough, right? Now, depending on how long it takes, how many images you have to train, if you have enough patience and the right technology and right data, you can have discriminator fail like very quickly by saying, hey, okay, this is good enough. Or you can have a discriminator which is actually so intense in finding fakes that your deepfake becomes so real that it is very hard, even for discerning eyes like people like us who actually can look very, very minutely and fail and say, no, this is real. Right? So that's what GANs are.
This is also fascinating, and we are going to be getting to best practices and the best technology available, which is still developing, as you know, to try to identify deep fakes. And this is going to be even more difficult for journalists to do because we don't necessarily have access to laboratory conditions to do it. Bob Anthony, you've, like I said, covered this field for so long. I'm anxious to hear what questions you have for the panelists so far.
Well, I listened with interest with what Emma was saying. The audio deepfakes that she was talking about is basically within the reach of the consumer. I mean, we can reach sites, we can reach software, and we have the equipment available right now to do some of that audio deepfaking. I don't know if it was deep faked, but we saw the issue of OZ Media, which went out of business on Friday and sort of came back yesterday. But it all started with a phone call that was supposed to be from a YouTube person that wasn't. It was apparently easily done, but also easily caught. So problem there, according to Ashish, and the technology is still beyond the average consumer. I assume that you would agree with me on that, but not by much. Maybe we're 1 or 2 generations of processors away from putting this in the laps of the average consumer. And Henry already said that some of this processing can be done off the device. So, you know, some of it, obviously not Tom Cruise quality, is available to everyone yet. So I'm not going to answer any questions for the moment, but I'm liking how the panelists are showing us how close this is to the hands of the ones who would do bad, and the technology that's sort of still out of their reach. So on that one point, I think they've done a good job of informing us so far.
I should say, Bob, one quick one with Descript. Last time I checked, you still had to sign up for that software. You couldn't just download it and get it. And there is, last I checked, there was a pretty long waiting list. It took us a while to actually get access to it. So it is in the hands of consumers essentially, but you have to be one of the few that gets access. That was last I checked. I haven't looked recently at what that looks like and whether it's available, but you did have to sign up and you did have to wait until you got access to that technology.
But does it require a high entry bar? Do you need a really good equipment to use it?
Just a computer.
It's a service. Yeah. Can I just quickly throw one more thing here? As we're talking about video and audio, but one thing that is also really concerning is text deepfakes, where AI can generate text, which actually are even harder to discern, right? So yes, you know, you can fake people using deepfakes of video and audio and images and whatnot. But you know, when journalists writing starts to get faked, and then opinions are formed and misinformation is delivered through that artificially written content, that can also be very, very scary.
I don't know if anyone knows any particular issues with regard to text. That's fascinating, Ashish. But for some time now, various news services have had essentially computer-generated writing for routine things like earnings reports and so forth. Is that based on the same technology, to your knowledge, Ashish?
It is actually, the technologies evolved from in last couple of years actually a lot, right? With OpenAI, which you know, which is an independent company, but Microsoft has funded a lot. There is technologies from Google called BERT, which is actually, so these are latest technologies which are being used to create, you know, writing, which actually, so automation writing, yes, it has been around, but now the writing can also start thinking about forming opinions based on the you know, the target audience, and it can be very personalized at scale. So you may be actually reading something completely that actually goes with your values and your issues to influence you, versus I may be reading from the same author, from the same AI technology, something that actually is personalized for to motivate me to take an action. So that is different.
So are you saying that instead of just writing a baseball story, I can the computer can generate a baseball story that disparages a particular team, a story written in New York can say bad things about the Red Sox, which is, I hope we all do here.
You don't need a computer to do that.
So let's not go there, but what I'm concerned about is the spread of disinformation using these technologies, right? And manipulating people's belief, kind of very similar to what some of us are starting to call cognitive hacking, essentially hacking of the mind using written and imagery and videos, which are all can be generated at scale and spread at speed using AI.
I'm really glad that Ashish brought up this comment about cognitive hacking, because I think the reality is you don't need something that is cinematic quality to convince people of a certain point of view. What we've seen in the genocide in Myanmar with information that's completely fabricated, circulating on WhatsApp, or videos that are on YouTube, they're not made oftentimes by people as talented as Chris Ume, the person who created the Tom Cruise deepfake. Really, the barrier is not that hard to convince the general public that something is when it isn't. So we live in a time where perception is reality. You go on TikTok and there's so many different types of synthetic content.
And Jareen, you're breaking up, unfortunately. So
and
I don't know if Jareen can hear us. Yeah, your image froze, Jareen. Maybe you need to drop off and rejoin. Before we
out in order to convince a lifestyle. So I think this is one of the situations where we are entering a world where perception is reality, and technology does not have to be that advanced to sway the minds of others.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting conversation as well, Jareen, because I think we're in an era as well where news literacy is probably not as good as it used to be in the general public either. I think it takes a discerning ear and a discerning eye to detect some of this. And I personally would love to see better news literacy and more critical analysis and critical thinking in the general public to see these things and actually question it, because you're right, in this era of just seeing is believing. But what if you can't trust your ears and eyes? And how are we training people, or how are we giving the public and also journalists the capability to detect this? It's a conversation that we're not really there yet. A lot of schools used to have news literacy and critical analysis built into them. Sometimes we don't see that as much anymore. I mean, I feel like we could discuss this for days, this particular topic around how do we create this critical thinking so that people can make up their minds for themselves, so that we don't have this, people believing both sides of the scales and getting stuck in these echo chambers. And it's a super interesting topic.
We're going to be shifting the conversation in just a moment to identifying deep fakes and how to do that. I recognize them when they cross your transom. I want to go to a question from the audience. This is from Raj Rangarajan. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, from International Press Syndicate. Raj asks, now that we know that deep fakes are here to stay, do we think Capitol Hill can do something about it? Earlier today, we watched a whistleblower, former Facebook employee, articulate the problems that we are all heir to. Thoughts from any of you panelists on that question from Raj?
I don't think we need to look for to politicians for this. I mean, we as journalists need to be better at making the case for people, for readers, listeners, to be more critical in what they look at and what they see. I mean, I'm sitting here, we try to be honest with what we give to the public. I'm sitting here with the SPJ Code of Ethics here. I mean, we try we try hard to be honest and true with what we give the public. Don't know if legislation coming out of Washington is the way to go. I'll be brief. I have other things I can add to that, but for the sake of time, I'll limit that.
I don't
probably
even
disagree
know whether
with
it's
that. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Jareen.
I would disagree with that because a lot of the companies that allow for the dissemination of information to spread so quickly are American companies, American tech companies. And, you know, we are global, right? We're a global community, and we've already seen, I mentioned genocide in Myanmar, like journalists don't have the same opportunities to hold people to account in different countries. In fact, we saw Reuters journalists imprisoned in Myanmar for reporting on the genocide. We've seen people killed in Sri Lanka for disinformation, misinformation. We've seen journalists in India basically run out of villages, especially women, who had deep fakes made of them to show them in sexually explicit acts in order for like the public to turn on them and to discredit them. So I don't think journalists I think journalists can actually be targeted by deepfake technology. And I think the reality is that our reporting is not enough to combat the growth of this technology in a way that can tackle the problem at scale.
Without belaboring the point, would you think that government, either US or otherwise, is the right place to find the people that can help?
It's interesting because there's a lot of tech companies that there are a lot of tech companies that claim that they want regulation. And, you know, like I think we just had actually Mark Zuckerberg not too long ago say he was saying something like, okay, well, what regulations are there? And I think it's a really difficult question to ask and to point blame. But the reality is like, I think ethically we should be asking, like, should it be this easy for me to upload a video and for 5 million people to see it in a couple of hours, right? And there's not enough content moderators in the world in order to like check this information. For example, I think like these stats have changed since I last looked at them, but in under a minute, I think Facebook gets about 4 million video content that's uploaded onto its platform. There's not enough humans that can check that, right? For things like child pornography, there's not enough machine technology to like currently that's operated, maybe Ashish can talk about this, that can like knock down like deep fakes. So there's a problem. There's a real problem that I don't think humans, like we need to create some kind of technology in order to implement, in order to, again, at scale tackle this.
Yeah, but this is something we definitely touch on in the podcast as well. I don't know whether it's up to us journalists to say whether we should or shouldn't do something. I think it's up to journalists to present the arguments for and against and to have a nuanced conversation and for people to make up their own mind and governments to make up their mind. There's certainly, the technology is being created more rapidly than legislation and regulation is being created, and it's scrambling to catch up. This technology is in the world, and you know, we've interviewed a lot of people over time on the expert side, on that are for regulation, against regulation. And I think the one common theme is that there needs to be more transparency in this industry. There needs to be more explainability in this industry, and people need to be able to understand what's going on behind the hood, or so to speak, underneath all of these algorithms. Because until we have a better understanding of what's actually going on, how can you actually create legislation and laws, and the technology is just, you know, being created so quickly.
I want Ashish
it's really interesting.
I want Ashish to jump in here. Ashish, you've got a comment for us.
Yeah, so I partially agree with Robert and partially with Jareen, but let me actually put my point of view. One is technology, the speed and scale makes it super hard to detect, right? Both from a content moderation perspective and humans, forget humans, right? Nobody is actually using 100% humans. it's AI and HI. The AI, so you try to get like almost 90+% of your content, or almost 100%, and the flagged ones can go to human intelligence and do that. And still, the speed and scale makes it really, really hard. So that's just on the moderation side. But on the detection side itself, right? I don't know if you, I wrote a post on this, but Henry may remember it when Facebook did the Facebook detection challenge. It was open to all, the best of the best, scientists out there. They participated in it. And the best precision they could get was around 65% accuracy, right? And let me actually, just a technical term was accuracy, was around 65%. So meaning that it's as good as flipping the coin a bit better, right? That it's a fake or not. And that was a year and a half back. The technology has developed even farther. The speed and scale is hard. So going back to a couple of things, especially around regulation, I feel that having regulations around deepfakes is different because we kind of confuse the terminology as well, right? Synthetic media has supreme positive use cases, right? Emma talked about some. Accessibility is the biggest one, which I feel very close to as well. People losing their voice actually can have artificial voice that can give them more agency. People who have challenges with their vision can get AI generated navigation applications for them, which can actually narrate the world around it. There's a lot of innovation in other places as well, education, entertainment, even complex engineering, right? Think about doing high level fidelity simulations before you start building bridges, right? That's all AI generated fakes, right? At the end of the day. Now we talk about malicious use, which we typically would actually club together. So malicious use is like deep fakes and what we are concerned about. But history has shown us whenever a new technology arrives, the leaders of it actually would try to, so the people who actually use it are people who have a malicious intent to use that technology. That is how it's like, and then eventually, all of us see the light. There are policies, there are regulations, there are technology built, and eventually we cross the chasm of, hey, now that let's talk about positive use cases. And then we have seen this. So my last point on regulation is, I think regulation is not the answer. What is the answer is a multimodal and multi-stakeholder kind of thinking through and finding solutions in technology, media literacy, regulations, as well as companies to do introspection and create their own best terms of use and policies. And I'll give the floor to Henry because that's what I think he's trying to get to with Metaverse is create that kind of standards and compliance and governance body.
Yeah, I thank you, Ashish. Yeah, I think one key question to me is regulating what? For example, criminalizing synthetic image abuse in the sexual environment, critically important. That's something that's going on the state and federal level in the US. That's something the Law Commission here in the UK are doing. That's trying to make it so that this is a criminal act, right? This is not a civil case that people have to pay for and bring themselves, but it's something the state will prosecute offenders for. And one of the things I've seen continually throughout my research in this space is people still think it's a joke who are creating this content. They don't take it seriously, and they don't recognize the harm they're doing to everyday women. And as the technology gets more accessible, targets move from celebrities to private individuals who don't have the funds to fund, legal challenges themselves. So on that front, yes, legal action is really important. When it comes to legislating against kind of more general uses of synthetic media, as she's touched on, this is a technology which is behind the computational photography in your smartphone camera. This is behind a lot of the things you see in Hollywood VFX and engineering, applications as she's touched on, and also some of the really, really powerful and quite profound accessibility uses as well. So, the technology is multifaceted. There are many different uses, many bad ones which we need to address, and we need to work from multi-stakeholder perspectives to address. But I think kind of regulating deepfakes or synthetic media as a general category is not a very useful way of framing the problem.
Yeah. We're going to have to move on. We have a lot of questions from our audience that we want to get to. But before we do that, I'd like to hit on clues to deepfakes that actually do exist today, and there's research being done. This is the Albany, New York campus of the State University of New York, where a professor by the name of Siwei Lyu has been working on deepfakes for a long time, doing research here. He's the founding director of the Computer Vision and Machine Learning Lab at SUNY Albany. I just thought it would be interesting to touch on some of the research that he's done on something called, in other words, he's basically found associations with face warping artifacts, bispectral analysis of speech, the lack of eye blinking. We asked, we sent a message to Dr. Lyu. Unfortunately, he has not returned our message. We asked him to participate or comment on tonight. We haven't heard from him. I'm not even sure he got the message because his email on his personal page is one of those things that's phonetically spelled out so that it can't be copied by bots. I guess my question to those of you who are more technically inclined is, could anybody put this into English for us? These are clues to deep fakes. What are face warping artifacts? Anybody?
Yeah, so this is something that we at NBC and other verification teams that I've been in, like artifacts is also in the realm of like photoshopping, where sometimes you'll see a badly photoshopped magazine cover of a woman's arm just like slightly thinner, and it's clear that she's been altered. Very similar to some deep fakes. Of course, the stuff that we saw with Tom Cruise is very different, and that's like a different technology I'm sure Henry can dive into. But some of the face swapping technology does show some, it leaves some artifacts, meaning like certain proportions are incorrect, or there's even some forms of like pixelation that might happen. There might be a delay in like a face tracking and movement. But those artifacts, there's like certain types of checklists, and I know that I'm sure other experts can talk about this, but those are some of the things to keep an eye out for, as well as the blinking thing really is true if it's completely like video manipulated. However, I think there are exceptions when you have actors, which again, the Tom Cruise one's a good example of, you do see more emoting of the actor's face. So there are definitely some exceptions to these checklists.
There's another aspect to this that I just quickly want to share again. This is a very recent paper by Dr. Lyu, and you can find this on the SUNY Albany website. Pupils with jagged edges. Pupils with jagged edges. And this is directly pulled from one of the papers that's available online. There is a real pupil on the left, which according to ophthalmologists should either be perfectly round or elliptical, as that one is on the left, and the deep fake pupil, which has jagged edges. And Dr. Lyu was very specific. He said, now this obviously can't be, you have to make exceptions for the possibility of disease in the eye, but when you are looking at two healthy eyes, the one on the left is real, the one on the right is deep fake. I was really curious about this, and I'm wondering if anybody else has had experience with this. Just for fun, by the way, I did a freeze frame of the Tom Cruise deepfake that we have, and I tried to do a close-up of his eyes there. I don't think it's conclusive. One of our panelists said to me when we showed them this, they said, well, you know, the one on the left does look like it might have a jagged thing, but the one on the right, it's kind of out of focus. There's reflection there. Any thoughts from any of you and any of the techies on our panel?
I'd be happy to comment on that. I think one thing to state to start would be that the types of manipulation you look for will change depending on the model used to generate the output. So, for example, with stylogram images, there are very specific tells that you can see, at least in certain versions, around, for example, fine detail around the hair. You'll get swirling and artifacting in that space. You'll see a certain alignment across certain images of the faces, which kind of map together. As Jareen touched on, you know, with face swapping in particular, the way that the mask is trained onto the target head will, for example, have even like this filter now, kind of, which I'm using for blurring, you'll get kind of, you know, flickering and lossy style low fidelity around the edges of the face. You may also see, for example, skin tone mismatch, and also warping when profiling changes, so turning the head. That's because the images that the model is trained on can, you know, the model can only generate outputs that the data contains on the whole. The research that Siwei Lyu did on blinking, for example, that came out in late 2018 and is just not that relevant, unfortunately, anymore for a lot of the contemporary models that are now being published. And I think one point I really want to drive home for your audience here is that these tells may be useful in certain contexts, but they can be actually more damaging than good because they give you false confidence that you know how to detect something which has moved on from the standard that that research was done in. And you know, the jagged pupils, again, is not a consistent tell across a lot of different fakes that we see. So I think it's just really important to emphasize that, you know, you can go down a bit of a rabbit hole here, looking for things that aren't there. Some of the cases I've worked on, for example, you know, again, highly compressed, low fidelity video has artifacting and glitching in key areas that may look like a tell, but in fact are not. And that has led to actually crisis situations in Myanmar, as Jareen is talking about, where a video was believed to be a deepfake that wasn't, and people started putting this through detection systems which weren't robust. Sam and I were on the scene doing some analysis of this video and seeing in real time people sharing this in the thousands on social media saying this is a deepfake, they deepfake this politician who's confessing to these crimes. Our conclusion was it's most likely a false confession, but it wasn't fake. So really important to recognize that humans are not necessarily very reliable in this fight.
I'd like to ask the journalists on our panel before we get to a couple of more audience questions. So just how useful are any of these detection tips or technologies going to be to a journalist on deadline who also has to worry about the competition getting something? Any of our journo panelists want to comment on that one?
I'm not in daily anymore. I'm more in long form, but I would say primary sources, primary sources, primary sources, fact check, fact check, fact check. And there are organizations out there as well that do this for their job. So if you have questions or concerns, there actually are places to go for that are experts in this. One thing I would advocate for is having people trained on your staff in some of these areas, at least to look at things with a discerning eye, whether it be to train a deepfakes task force, or at least have a list of people that you can call if you have a situation like this. I don't think, especially in this era of fake news in journalism, it's so hard to gain trust now, harder than ever for journalists to be trusted. Why would you rush to put something out there? We want people to trust us. Have a list, have at least a group, a working group, someone responsible, and reach out for help if you need it. You don't need to be first to the story. Citizen journalism is on the rise. People will put it out there regardless. What we want to do as journalists is what we're put here on this earth to do, which is to report fact, to verify, to check things. And it is getting harder and harder. And in this daily news environment, it's super, super challenging. So create either a task force or someone to go to in that organization that has knowledge of this and have a list of go-tos to help you verify that information. Unless, of course, you're deeply trained. Like I know, Jareen, you probably have thoughts on this given what you've done with your unit over at NBC before you moved across to Amazon.
Yeah, so I did live in this world of instantaneously having to give answers around manipulated content or even just like misinformation, disinformation. And it's really hard. It's true. Like we're really unreliable. Like I do believe that primary sources are some of the best mechanisms. Like if there's, for example, politician claiming to confess to crimes, well, like, are we able to find any other footage captured by someone who may have been in the area that shows similar footage that matches that video? Are we able to call people that may have worked with this politician to confirm that video? So that's kind of the way that verification teams are currently operating, is this level of using still the fundamentals of journalism, still fact checking, still calling like sources, government sources, primary sources, whatever the case may be. There's also the avenue of, there's two avenues. One is teaming up with a visual investigations team. For example, some of the more complex investigations that NBC has done around, for example, the Capitol riots in January. we worked with Bellingcat, which is this investigative outfit based in Europe, in order to analyze thousands of videos of people breaking into the Capitol. And that was something where there's like this coalition of journalists now using open source technology as a way of doing verification work and working together in collaboration. There's also another avenue where you see some journalists partnering up with universities. Like I know Rochester, for example, Institute of Technology has scientists that are working on ways of creating technology to help with verification as well. There's dozens of universities actually that do that, as well as Google has a team where they're training journalists on better research mechanisms as well. So there are a lot of different types of avenues to go into. And if you have a newsroom or you're a journalist that's interested in this kind of reporting, there's actually free tools and groups that can train you and help you to navigate this kind of information space.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Jareen, because it segues beautifully into our next topic as we start to wrap things up, which is, as a journalist or as a content provider, how do I actually protect my work from being manipulated? Or is there anything we can do to protect our work? If my multimedia work in particular is out there, how can we protect it? We actually had a question from the audience earlier from a Luis Irizarry. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. He asked, do you see provenance-based solutions as the best long-term protection against ever-improving deep fakes? I'm going to ask Ashish to jump in on this because I know you've been active in a lot of the solutions with regard to what I believe journalist organizations and publishers are calling a secure pipeline approach. Can you talk about that?
Yes, absolutely. When we talk about technology solutions to disinformation or deepfakes in particular, we talk about detection, which I already made a claim that it is super hard and will not work in long term. So what works in long term is provenance. And the provenance is just a mechanism to find, or attribute to the origins where it came from. We invented a technology in, I think, 3 years back, essentially, in our research organization, Microsoft Research, called AMP. It's authentication via media provenance. And the idea was that if you can, when you publish a piece of content, multimedia, image or video, but it can also apply to text. If you can put a signal in there or a signature of you, essentially, saying, hey, this is me, this is my piece of content, we'll actually package it with the content, and that piece of signal at the distribution endpoint can be checked and verified. Now, if the content gets manipulated, then the piece of signal actually gets invalidated, right? Because the way we package it is similar to what we have known for almost 3 decades or 2 decades or more, actually, called digital signatures. So it is more than digital signatures, but the idea is same, right? Is if you can add some kind of signal to the piece of content when you publish, and we can ensure that this piece of content is not manipulated, tampered with, and at the distribution endpoint, you can verify that using the signal and the content, then you can actually protect your work. So we invented this technology. Adobe, during similar times, actually around the same time, had this initiative going on called CAI, or Content Authenticity Initiative, which was very focused on images. Similar idea, implementation essentially around their products called Photoshop and others. So after actually working with them and others in the industry, we realized that, hey, this is a bigger problem. One individual company cannot solve it. So we created the standards group in February last year, early February this year, even though we have been working together for quite some time with Twitter, Adobe, Microsoft, Intel, ARM, BBC, and others to create the standards body called C2PA, Coalition for Content Authenticity and Provenance and Authenticity, C2PA. And the idea there is that we will create a technology standards for this idea that I just talked about, which is can put a piece of signal that can be verified at the distribution point, then you know that the content is coming from a trusted source. Now, the idea there is, it is all about trust, not about the truth, right? I can actually create a deep fake and sign it with my name and publish it out there. Then at least you know that this Ashish created this deep fake and signed it, right? So the idea is, can you attribute it to the publisher? And if you trust the publisher, then you can trust the information as well. So it's very agnostic, it's very technical standards. Now we have almost 30 plus organizations across the globe, as well as some news media organizations who are helping us to shape the standard. And using the standard, we are actually building technology ourselves, as well as Adobe is implementing them, BBC is implementing. The idea is, again, provenance, I think, is the long-term solution to fight deepfakes and disinformation.
A couple of our listeners, Maria Escala and Sam Matheny, have asked basically the same question. What about blockchain? Can this be a way of protecting content?
There is an implementation of blockchain behind the scenes as well, right? So when you pass a signal, can you also put it in a chain of custody so that if, as it goes through the pipeline, you know, if there was manipulated for the right reasons, right? Because as you know, as journalists, sometimes you publish something, it gets cuts in the newsroom. Eventually what you see on the TV may not be the whole piece, right? So if it gets manipulated on chain of custody called blockchain, can you put that audit there? So at least not only you know if it was tampered, but you know why it was tampered and how it was tampered, so you can trust it as well.
If I may add,
yeah, go ahead.
Casey?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Just to kind of add to what Ashish is saying there, and I think that's a great description of how it works. From our perspective at Metaphysic, right, we fundamentally don't want to deceive people with the content that we're creating. And one of the solution approaches that we see there is to use a very similar standard to mark synthetic content using similar kinds of change of provenance to make sure that people aren't fooled by it. Obviously, there are certain contexts such as cinema, for example, where we're already exposed to movie magic in every film we see, where perhaps that isn't necessary. But in other contexts, such as satire and things like this, you know, we see that as a valuable kind of addition. And I think briefly as well, I think one of the best ways that journalists can protect their work is to remain trustworthy and remain reporting accurately. Several cases I've worked on, journalists have recorded and reported on deepfakes that weren't deepfakes. One notorious example of a cheerleader's mum creating deepfakes of her rivals wasn't a deepfake. That went through the police all the way up to the DA of Pennsylvania. The BBC, including world reputable sources, all reported on this. I did an investigation on this with a reporter, wasn't a deepfake. They got it completely wrong and no one offered redactions or published corrections. So I think making sure that you know your facts and you don't comment on something you don't necessarily understand fully is also crucial in this.
We have a question from our Deadline Club colleague and former CNBC and CNN journalist, Alan Chernoff. Alan writes, at a time when social media is rapidly spreading misinformation and people are swallowing it whole, to what degree will deepfakes magnify the problem of making lies believable? Anybody?
Well, I don't even think it has to be a deep fake. Like, I'm sure the panel remembers the Nancy Pelosi like cheap fake that showed her at the podium speaking, and it was being shared by these right-wing pundits claiming she was drunk. But really what it was whoever altered the video slowed down the voice track and made it choppy. So it just sounded like the cadence of her voice was altered because she was allegedly not well or something was wrong. So it doesn't have to be sophisticated in order for people to be swayed. And I think this goes on to a comment that was made earlier about like people in echo chambers and on social media and being fed information that essentially validates how they're feeling. I just absolutely love that comment, that that phrase Ashish had used about cognitive hacking. You know, when we think about hacking, right? Like in movies, it's like some guy sitting in front of a computer typing away some code and then he instantly breaks into your email. That's not really what happens. Sophisticated hacking uses a lot of human psychology. You get an email that says, hey, you know, your boss sent me this file. Do you mind like just checking it out? And you click on it, and that's, you know, the hacker gains access into your work, and that's using different elements of what fundamentally make us human, right? Trust, belief. We're using our senses, but our senses and our trust don't always, our intuition doesn't always guide us in the right direction. And so we need other ways of discerning information. I think that I think people want to learn. I think media literacy is something that people do crave. I think it's a matter of how do we deliver that information so that people feel empowered to understand and at least be more deciphering of what they're looking at, because we're talking about a global community that has access to so much information. And when people have shorter and shorter attention spans, when videos are only 15 seconds long on TikTok, how do we get people to start thinking with more like a detective, really, right? More discerning. And I think that's probably one of the things that I hope that journalists start thinking about as we produce content, is not just saying, hey, this is true or false, but also how did we get there? How did we figure out that, you know, this video isn't really what it claims to be? And here are some steps that we took. It doesn't have to be like always under the hood, but I think giving some context for the reader is very helpful.
I'd like to ask one question to all the panelists as we start to wrap this up. I go back a long way in news, you know, back when we actually used something called audio tape to do audio interviews and videotape to do video interviews. And there was more or less, I guess you could call it a secure pipeline, because you knew that you had stood there and interviewed someone, you had come back to the edit room, you had actually edited it in something called analog fashion and produced the tape and handed it off. There was really no potential for manipulation. Fast forward to today, where we have so much content that's aggregated and aggravated. Journalists are spend a lot of time collecting content from other sources that they haven't been in a position to verify personally. Was it a mistake to let that camel in the tent, so to speak?
So I worked in news gathering, which I was fortunate to work in some really, really big newsrooms, NBC, CBS, CNN, that had a lot of money to do news gathering. And news gathering is a very expensive endeavor. You got to fly a journalist to a location, you know, you bring a crew, you bear witness. And as time has gone on, we have all seen newsrooms and that financing shrink. And we've relied more on UGC video in order to help supplement our coverage. And I think
user-generated content. I just want to point out the acronym there, user-generated content.
Thank you. Yes. So videos that we see on Facebook and Twitter, for example, from citizen journalists, to supplement our coverage, especially in local news settings or digital news that don't have that robust multi-million-dollar worldwide news gathering operation. But this, I think, touches on the fact that it's really costly in order to bear witness. And newsrooms today, not every newsroom is created equal when it comes to financing. And I think there is a sincere need for journalism, the industry, to really look into how it's making money. I think many papers and media organizations are really struggling with that. And if we want to get back to, you know, going on the scene and covering things in real life in real time, that's going to be really expensive. Just like blockchain is very expensive currently. And so a lot, you know, money can help, but right now we aren't in a situation in the journalism industry where there is a lot of money to utilize. So sometimes partnering up with universities, like I had mentioned, or other media operations that specialize in like open source intelligence investigations, that's kind of like a band-aid for a larger issue or many issues that kind of need to be addressed in our industry.
Well, and it's an interesting topic talking about money and news, right? You get what you pay for, and it all started with this era of free content and putting free content up on the internet. And now we're here today. If we paid for content, if we were taught to pay for content in a way that we paid for other things in our lives, then that content would hopefully be more trustworthy because more money can be invested in the actual journalism. When you're not funding journalism, then you're not getting journalism, right? So if you're reading something for free, you need to put that detective hat on and really critically analyze what you're looking at. If you're paying for it, hopefully you trust the organization that you're paying for that information. And obviously there's exceptions and rules. There's government funded media. There's different places that fund things through different areas. But it's a really interesting conversation when it comes back to like content and how it's created and funding of the news. And I think you're right, Jareen, you touched on something very interesting in terms of funding this and how do we, at the moment we're putting band-aids on things because we can't go back. The reality is we're in this situation. Steve, you asked the question around like, have we done the wrong thing? Or I can't remember exactly how you phrased it, but you know, what's done is done and cannot be undone. As Lady Macbeth once said, we're here now and we need to deal with what's going on.
I'm going to ask Bob Anthony to jump in with some final thoughts as we're getting close to closing time. Bob, any questions that you haven't asked yet or any thoughts that you haven't had a chance to convey?
Well, basically, we have to make sure we maintain our basic journalism standards. I can remember so many times in the newsroom when my old editor, Bob Wills, former actual SPJ president, unfortunately recently passed, would ask me or someone else in the newsroom, how do you know that? Where'd that come from? What do you mean this happened? Who told you that? Well, we got to get somebody else to verify that. Or what stringer got that? Call them up, get them in, get them in the newsroom, get them on the phone. I can remember one incident where we had a terrible fire at an old beer hall, and we kept getting rumors that people were dead. 6 people are dead. We had reporters on the site that didn't see any dead bodies, didn't see any ambulances. We went to the morgue. We called the morgue. Did you send a truck to pick up any bodies? We didn't. So while everybody else was reporting that there were dead people at this fire, I was on the desk that day, one of the people on the desk. We held back. We just kept asking the questions. And in this electronic age, that's what you have to keep on doing. Even with the user-generated content, even with the content from the smaller news organizations, got to stick with those, got to keep asking those questions.
We are a skeptical age, and we need to be even more skeptical as journalists. As many of you know, the quote from Dan Rather, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. Unfortunately, I think that's just about all the time we have. I'd like to thank you all for participating in this discussion on deepfakes and the future of journalism. For those of you who are new to the Deadline Club, I'd like to encourage you to check us out at deadlineclub.org. As one of SPJ's largest chapters, serving New York area journalists since 1925, the Deadline Club is dedicated to perpetuating freedom of the press, encouraging the highest standards of excellence and ethics, and fostering career development through our awards, scholarships, workshops, talks like this, and even, believe it or not, in-person social networking mixers. Again, a final thanks to my co-moderator, Robert Anthony, and our panelists, Ashish Jaiman, Jareen Imam, Emma Cillikens, and Henry Ajder, joining us very late at night from the UK. I'm Steve Dunlop in New York. Thank you all. Throwing it back to Colin.
Hey, everybody. This is just an incredible discussion. Really appreciated all of you for your time. Steve, wonderful program. And I hope to see more of this in the future. And I hope to see you all again, maybe perhaps in person soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.